Hey friends, it's me, Miss Terrell. This is our final presentation PowerPoint on period 5. Following Reconstruction, we are looking at the birth of the New South. So this is essentially what the South will look like under these Reconstruction plans. Like I said, Reconstruction is highly controversial because some people really sit back and kind of look at, was it a good thing or was it a bad thing, and kind of weigh out those pros and cons. One thing that was super evident with Reconstruction and obviously with the emancipation of slaves is that there was going to need to be a change in the farming techniques. The white plantation owners of the South have lost millions, billions of dollars worth of free slave labor. So now they had to figure out if they were going to continue with an agricultural based lifestyle, how they were going to afford to do that. So the loss of slave labor raised grave questions for Southern agriculture. Would cotton still be the king? Who would work the fields? And how would Black emancipation affect, of course, the poor white laborers of the South? In all honesty, nobody really knew the answers to these questions, so they kind of just had to go with the flow and see what was going to work. The first new farming technique we'll talk about is sharecropping. Sharecroppers farmed some part of the planter's land as payment. The farmers were promised a share of the crop at harvest time. So typically they would get a third or half of the yield and they could do what they wanted to do with it. They could sell it, they could use some for themselves, so on and so forth. As part of the payment, the planter usually provided housing for the family. Sharecroppers worked under close supervision and threat of harsh punishment if they weren't working the land as well as their owner thought that they should. So it was not the people who became sharecroppers had their freedom, but it was not a full economic financial freedom because they still depended on somebody to provide housing for them and they still had to give their share or part of their earnings away. Some dishonest planters would evict sharecroppers at the end of the harvest and, of course, not pay them. So you would do a whole harvest worth of work, and you'd get nothing in the end, which would be pretty devastating to most of these families, and definitely these sharecroppers. The second technique is tenant farming. Tenant farmers did not own the land that they farmed on. They paid to rent the land, and they could therefore choose what crops they wanted to plant and how much they wanted to work. Tenant farmers enjoyed a bit of a higher social status than sharecroppers did, but still was not an easy lifestyle to maintain. Talking a little bit about the effects of these two, sharecropping and tenant farming, the effects that they had on the South. One, changes in labor force. 40% of the cotton crop was now harvested by white laborers who were mostly tenant farmers. So believe it or not, most of our tenant farmers in the South are going to be, well, not most of them, but at least 40% of them are going to be white folks. There is still an emphasis on cash cropping, and those crops are cotton, tobacco, and sugarcane. Soon, as a result of initiating these types of farming, post-war production of cotton ends up surpassing pre-war levels. So they kind of get back in the saddle with cotton. But the question is, if they went back to growing as much cotton as they did before the war, now where are they getting their food from? Have they reverted back to old cycles of depending on the North to give them their food? And nobody is really switching gears and trying to pay attention to the important things, like maybe we should industrialize a little bit. Maybe we should make sure that we're growing enough food to sustain ourselves. One major negative thing about sharecropping and tenant farming is that essentially it produces a cycle of debt. Essentially, you are using this year's profits to pay off last year's bills, And this is a cycle that just continues, continues, and continues. And if you find yourself working as a sharecropper for a jerk who is going to evict you at the end of the harvest, then you're really going to be out of luck because you're going to have to pick up and move, and you're going to do a year's worth of work with nothing to show for it, with last year's bills that still need to be paid. So really, sharecropping and tenant farming, although a step up from slavery, and now we know that the poor white farmers from the pre-war era are now involved in it, we know that it is not really creating a stable economic environment in the South in general. We do see, however, a rise in the merchants, a merchant class emerging from this time period, which is really important because now tenant farmers need, or they help to create a wealthy class of Southerners, and those people are merchants because now people have a little money in their pocket and they can buy things, and they want to buy things in the South instead of depending on the North. So we will see the rise of a merchant class during this time period. Lastly, as a result of the Emancipation and Reconstruction and how it worked out, we see the rise or the birth of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, right? So here's a picture of two Klans members right here in the early days. The Ku Klux Klan is born, if you will, in 1866. So right after the war is over, about a year after the war is over, in Pulaski, Tennessee. Members wore robes and masks and pretended to be the ghost of Confederate soldiers who had returned from the dead in search of revenge against the enemies of the South. So they pledged to defend the social and political superiority of whites against what they called the aggressions of an inferior race. And in this time, they are talking about Black men and women and children, but they're also talking about anyone essentially who is not Protestant, white, Anglo-Saxon. So your French, your Catholics, your natives, anybody who's not white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant. The KKK becomes a strong group working in the South, particularly in the Deep South. And this comes along with the other things that we talked about with Reconstruction. Some towns setting up, establishing, black codes. I'm just looking for these notes because now that we have, yes, right here. So now that we have all these free former slaves who are now free walking around, we got to figure out how we're going to handle that situation. So a lot of these southern states, these little towns and communities had initiated rules that basically, even though the slaves were free, they didn't have all the freedoms that other people in society did. So like the vagrancy laws, the black codes, which include the curfews, the vagrancy laws, the contracts, the restrictions, and so on and so forth. These also play into the hands of the KKK, who are, in a sense, trying to keep these other inferiors down during this time. There is more extensive information on this, the New South or the birth of the New South, in your reading for this chapter, rather for this unit. So make sure you're doing that. And if you have any questions, feel free to send me a message. Take care. Bye-bye.